With that, I want to welcome you all to the Leo Baeck Institute. My name is Markus Krah. I'm the Executive Director of the LBI here at the Center for Jewish History. For those of you who don't know what the LBI, the Leo Baeck Institute, is or does, just the briefest of introductions before we get to the actual program. The Leo Baeck Institute is a research library and archive which was founded in 1955 with the mission to preserve and promote the history and culture of German-speaking Jews. Our primary job is to collect the papers and the memories of these people who left traces in various ways, in family collections, in business records, in works of art, in literature, and in other ways. They all found a home in the collections of the Leo Baeck Institute, much of which has been digitized. You have access to about 5 million pages of archival material on the history of German-speaking Jews through the LBI. This is a great resource for scholars who we support, but also a great resource for the public, for broader audiences who are interested in this topic, to whom we reach out by making this history accessible and show its relevance for today. In doing so, we aspire to reflect the entire breadth and length and depth of about 1,700 years of German Jewish history, or Jewish history in German-speaking lands. But of course, we have a strong focus on modern times, on the 20th century, and on the Holocaust. And we very much think that Austria, the Austrian experience of the Holocaust and Austrian Jewish history, is part of the brief of the Leo Baeck Institute, which is why we are so happy that we can host the exhibit we are opening today and the program tonight. If you are interested in the broader work of the Leo Baeck Institute, I invite you to see another exhibit, which is also downstairs in the hallway, which shows you the history of the past 70 years of the Leo Baeck Institute. And our curator, Magda Wrobel, standing in the back, wave your hands, is at hand to answer any questions about this. Before we get to tonight's program, I want to thank some of the people and institutions who made this exhibit and this program possible. I will introduce Michaela Raggam-Blesch, the driving force behind the exhibit and our main speaker today, more properly in a moment, but I want to welcome her to the program tonight. I also want to welcome George Langnas, who was a witness to what the exhibit is about and a survivor, and who will engage in a conversation with Michaela in the course of the program. Michaela will more properly introduce you and welcome you, but it is an honor to have you with us tonight. I also want to thank the Austrian Cultural Forum for supporting the exhibit. I want to thank the family of Charles and Madeleine Dreyfus, who support an exhibition fund at the Leo Baeck Institute. Magda, our curator, coordinated all this for the LBI. So this has been a teamwork, and it is wonderful that it has all come together and is ready for you to see and to be opened by the program tonight. Just a quick run of show of the coming 45 minutes or so. We will start with a short video by Monika Sommer, who is the director of the House of Austrian History and also one of the driving forces behind this exhibit, together with Michaela, who will then give a talk about the exhibit and the history it represents before she welcomes George for a conversation about this, which will then be followed by a brief Q&A period. I hope that you all had the opportunity to take a note card and a pencil when you registered to come in. At some point we will collect the note cards and the questions so we can have a little more streamlined process, because there's so beautifully many of us. And all this will be followed by a reception. You can already see the food in the back of this room, and then I invite you all to see the exhibition downstairs. So we will, as I said, start with a video immediately followed by Michaela's talk. So I'll introduce Michaela, and then we will start the program. Michaela Raggam-Blesch is a historian at the Institute of Contemporary History at the University of Vienna and a specialist on Austrian Jewish history in the 19th and 20th century. She has had more fellowships, visiting professorships, honors, and awards than I can mention here. She has worked for the Leo Baeck Institute in the past, and all this just shows why she's here with us tonight. There is no one who could provide a better introduction to the larger theme behind the exhibit we are opening tonight than Michaela, as the specialist on the specifically Austrian dimension of the history of the Holocaust, or as the exhibition is entitled, the Vienna Model of Radicalization. Thank you all for coming. I'm sure it will be a great program. Thanks for coming to Leo Baeck, and have a good evening.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the opening of the exhibition, the Vienna Model of Radicalization, Austria and the Shoah, tonight in the Leo Baeck Institute of New York. My name is Monika Sommer, and I'm the director of the House of Austrian History. Together with my dear colleagues, Heidemarie Uhl and Michaela Raggam-Blesch, I had the opportunity to curate and to organize this exhibition, which you will have the opportunity to see tonight. The House of Austrian History is a very young contemporary history museum located on the famous Heldenplatz in the Royal Palace, and we are also connected to the so-called Hitler balcony. Because of Austria's history, and also because we are situated on this historic place and in this historic site, our museum has a strong focus on Austria's role and Austria's tribute to the Nazi history. This exhibition is about the very shameful fact that in the city of Vienna, the system of deportations was developed and was kind of an inspiration for the whole Nazi Reich later on. So Austria is responsible for many things that happened during the Nazi era, and Austria is responsible for that fact until today. That's why we as House of Austrian History do a lot to educate people and also to be very aware of the anti-Semitism which is still in our society today. I wish you a great opening, and I send you my best greetings from Vienna to New York. Thank you. Dear ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the opening of
see the room so full, so I'm very grateful. Okay. I'm very grateful for this large turnout today. So thank you so much for the kind introduction and invitation to come here. And it is actually wonderful to return to the Leo Baeck Institute, where I actually took my first steps as a Holocaust scholar more than 20 years ago. When I was working as a PhD student in the archives of the Leo Baeck Institute with the memoir collection. So it's really great to be here. And first and foremost, I would like to express my gratitude to the Austrian Cultural Forum for making it possible to bringing this exhibition to New York. I would also like to extend my sincere thanks to the team of the Leo Baeck Institute, especially Magdalena Wrobel and Stephanie Ades, for their dedication in organizing everything on the ground, and for planning this opening event. So thank you very much. I would also like to take a moment to remember my longtime mentor and dear friend, Heidemarie Uhl, who curated this exhibition together with me and Isolde Vogel, and who unfortunately is no longer with us. Historians always stand on the shoulders of those who came before them, and this exhibition is no exception. It is not only based on the research of my colleagues and myself, but also on the pioneering work of the Austrian historian Hans Safrian. He was the first to highlight Austria's role in the radicalization of National Socialist policies, and in fact coined the term the Vienna Model. So I want to for sure mention him as well. Finally, I'm grateful to George Langnas, a survivor born in Vienna in 1935, for joining us today and for his willingness to participate in the Q&A session following these opening remarks. We also had hoped to include Edith Tausig tonight, who survived as a caregiver of the children's orphanage in Vienna. Sadly, she passed away just a few weeks ago here in New York, shortly after celebrating her 99th birthday. A photograph of her as a young woman with the children of the orphanage is featured in the exhibition, so you will be able to see that later on. Now, let me provide a brief background on the exhibition you will see tonight. It was first inaugurated in October 2021 in Vienna, commemorating the 80th anniversary of the systematic mass deportations from the German Reich. It shows Vienna and Austria as the testing ground for National Socialist persecution policies. The exhibition was made possible through the support of the Federal Ministry of European and International Affairs and the Federal Chancellery of Austria. After previous showings at the Holocaust Memorial Center in Budapest and the Wiener Holocaust Library in London, it is now being presented in the United States for the very first time. The opening today coincides with the anniversary of the Nazi takeover in Austria, the so-called Anschluss, which took place 87 years ago on the night of March 11 to March 12 in 1938. This was a night when, as the writer Karl Zuckmayer recalled, all hell broke out. Zuckmayer, who had found refuge in Austria after the Nazi seizure of power in Germany, managed to escape to Switzerland just days later. Many others, however, were caught completely off guard for the events that would soon unfold. The Nazi takeover in Austria marked the beginning of a campaign of terror aimed at the Austrian Jewish population. Even before anti-Jewish measures were officially enacted, individuals classified as Jewish were subjected throughout the city to pogrom-like attacks, humiliation, and abuse. They were forced to wash the streets with caustic soda to remove slogans from the previous Austrian government, while countless onlookers of all ages watched with open Schadenfreude. And I have here, hopefully, yes, no, sorry, going back. Yes, so here in this photo, you can see this also in the exhibition tonight. This is a photo of a so-called Reibpartie, or scrubbing crew, translated, which often targeted also well-dressed people and who were publicly humiliated in this kind of spectacle for the masses. And you can see also the onlookers, at least part of them. So these took place all over the city in many different ways. There were also children forced to clean, and there are many accounts. And I'm sharing one with you, one of Otto Vogel, who was the son of an Orthodox family who remembered the omnipresence of these pogrom-like attacks in his neighborhood. Quote, "We lived in the 2nd district on Krumbaumgasse. It was the center for religious Jews. On Saturday, March 12th, so the first day of the Anschluss, the SA and the Hitler Youth were raging through the streets. They entered houses and dragged people outside. This went on for weeks. People were driven out of their apartments and had to scrub the streets with buckets and brooms and brushes, which you can also see on this picture. My father and mother were taken out of the house to clean the street. The spectators cheered. And not only that, they kicked them and even poured a bucket of water over someone. It was not only water, that was caustic water and therefore acidic, because otherwise the oil-based paint would not have washed off." Quote end. This initial wave of unregulated violence and looting was soon replaced by systematic bureaucratic terror. Unlike in Germany, where anti-Jewish measures had been gradually introduced over the course of 5 years, they were implemented in Austria practically overnight. In addition to the looting of Jewish stores, Jews were fired from their jobs, banned from practicing their professions, and soon even evicted from their homes. In May 1938, the Vermögensverkehrsstelle, the Property Transaction Office, was established in Vienna. This was an institution that had no precedence in Germany and that tried to regulate the prevalent expropriations of Jewish stores and businesses without official authorization by Austrian Nazis after the Anschluss. In the same month, in May 1938, Jewish children were expelled from public schools, a measure only implemented after the so-called Kristallnacht in the rest of the German Reich. These anti-Jewish measures affected over 200,000 Austrians, members of the Jewish communities, as well as many individuals classified as Jewish only according to the Nuremberg laws. The majority of them, even before the Anschluss, lived in Vienna. The pogrom-like atmosphere in Vienna exposed an unprecedented level of anti-Semitic violence within Austrian society, which also contributed to the radicalization of anti-Jewish measures throughout the German Reich. Austria thus became a testing ground for the anti-Semitic policies of the Nazi regime. It was only after the so-called Kristallnacht in November of 1938 that the brutality of persecution in Germany reached the extent of persecution that had been prevalent in Austria since March of 1938. And I'm moving now to 3 chapters. Hopefully this will work. Okay. Maybe I need some tech help to get to the next slide. So the next slide and the next chapter is institutional terror. Oh, it is. Oh, yeah, now it works. Yes, so this is where we are. In addition to this grassroots violence that I just spoke about, came institutional terror with Adolf Eichmann's Central Office for Jewish Emigration. And now I hope not to lose my lecture. So Eichmann played a central role in escalating anti-Semitic persecution after the Anschluss. As an officer of the SS Security Service, the SD, Eichmann arrived in Vienna on March 16, so only days after the Anschluss in 1938. 2 days later, he led a raid on the Viennese Jewish community arresting its leaders and shutting down its headquarters. The Jewish community was later reopened under strict Nazi supervision, forced to focus on facilitating Jewish emigration. In August 1938, Eichmann established the Zentralstelle, the Central Office for Jewish Emigration, located in an expropriated palais of the Rothschild family. And this is actually the picture of that building, the backside of that palais. The goal of the Central Office was to expel Vienna's Jewish population as swiftly and efficiently as possible, forcing them to pay extortionate fees and relinquish their property before emigrating. By May 1939, within a year after the Nazi takeover, over 100,000 individuals classified as Jewish had left Austria. Based on this quote-unquote successful Viennese model, similar offices were later set up in Berlin, in Prague, and Amsterdam. The bureaucracy of terror developed in Vienna formed the springboard for Eichmann's career in the Reich Security Main Office in Berlin. Somehow this is not reacting. Okay, that might be the cause. Okay, I'm just going to continue and then maybe it's different. Oh, here it is. Yeah, it didn't work before, but it's fine. So another aspect of the Vienna model was the fact that Vienna was the first major city targeted to be quote-unquote free of Jews. On October 2nd, 1940, Adolf Hitler invited Hans Frank, the general governor of the occupied Polish territories, to a private meal in his Berlin apartment. Among the other guests was Baldur von Schirach, who had been appointed Reich governor and Gauleiter of Vienna a few months earlier. The ambitious Schirach seized the opportunity to propose the deportation of Vienna's Jewish population to the general government. Schirach's plan was to make Vienna the first major city in the German Reich to be declared, quote-unquote, free of Jews. Hans Frank rejected the proposal, deeming it unfeasible, but Hitler decreed otherwise. In early December, Schirach received written authorization that, and I'm quoting, the Führer had decided that the 60,000 Jews still resident in the Vienna Reichsgau should be deported to the general government in an expedited manner, that is, while the war is still in progress. And I'm quoting here, quoting here this document. And this is one of the few sources actually documenting a decision of Adolf Hitler regarding the deportation transports. And this was also used in the Nuremberg trials. And you will find this transcript document as a scan in the exhibition. At the time Schirach received the authorization in late 1940, the remaining Jewish population in Vienna numbered little more than 60,000 people, including Jews from the other Austrian provinces who had been forced to relocate to Vienna in the meantime. Yes, okay, thank you. That did work. So the latest aspect of the Vienna model of radicalization is Vienna as testing ground for deportations. Following the authorization to deport Vienna's Jewish population, the Central Office and Gestapo headquarters in Vienna, in cooperation with Adolf Eichmann's department at the Reich Security Main Office in Berlin, issued guidelines to organize systematic mass transports. The Central Office, now under Eichmann's successor Alois Brunner, was put in charge of organizing the deportations. In early 1941, many months before the start of the Reich-wide mass transports, the model for the organization of large-scale deportations was developed and tested in Vienna. For each transport, the central office detained around 1,000 people in newly established collection camps, or so-called Sammellager, in schools in the city's second district. Those summoned for deportation were only permitted to bring 50 kilos of luggage, were forced to surrender the keys to their apartments, and had to sign a renunciation of their property and assets. Between February and March 1941, 5 transports, each carrying 1,000 people, departed from Vienna's Aspang station to small towns in occupied Poland in the Lublin era. At the end of March, the transports were temporarily halted due to the military preparations for the war against the Soviet Union. In October 1941, October 41 was the start of the Reich-wide mass deportations. In the meantime, the goal of deportation transports had, though, shifted from expelling Jewish populations to killing them throughout the territories under Nazi control. Between February 1941 and October 1942, over 45,600 Austrian Jews were deported on 45 transports from Vienna to ghettos, death camps, and killing sites in, quote-unquote, the East. Only little more than 2,000 of those deported survived. Jews from Austria who had fled to other European countries were also caught by the Nazis and deported from their countries of refuge. In total, more than 60,000 Austrian Jews became victims of the Holocaust. The exhibition you're about to see incorporates documents produced by the Nazi apparatus of persecution, as well as sources of the local Jewish communities and contemporary articles in the press. It also includes the voices of the persecuted through letters, diaries, autobiographical manuscripts, court files, and survivor testimonies. The exhibition highlights Jewish self-help efforts and acts of resistance, but also Austria's post-war silence about the Holocaust, which benefited the perpetrators. For decades, Austria failed to acknowledge its shared responsibility for Nazi crimes. This exhibition sheds light on this historical reckoning. Thank you for your attention. And now I have the pleasure to introduce George Langnas, who was born 1935 in Vienna and whose mother, Mignon Langnas, is featured prominently in the exhibition, as she survived as a nurse of the Jewish Children's Hospital, which actually remained until the very end of the war. And why, we can talk about that also in the Q&A if you're interested. So now I would ask you, George, to join me. So you can you hear me? Yeah, perfect. So George, thank you for joining us here tonight. I know that you personally, you were born 1935 in June, if I remember correctly. Correct. So you were barely a 3-year-old, right, at the time of the Anschluss in 1938. So I assume you personally will not have many recollections of the events we just discussed right now. But I was wondering, how did the Nazi takeover affect your family? And I'm thinking here particularly of your father, who owned a business and who was particularly vulnerable to random arrests as a Jewish man and also as a Polish citizen. So maybe you can talk about.
First of all, I really don't have any particular memory of anything. I've heard a lot of things, read a lot of things. So basically, what I'm going to tell you and talk about are written records. And written records were by family members. My mother remained in Vienna throughout the war. She kept a diary. She wrote letters to her American relatives in New York until the U.S. went to war with Germany. And then she continued writing letters to her cousin in Switzerland. So the family had records of both her diary and letters, both to the U.S. and Switzerland. Most of what I'm going to tell you is basically contained in these records. And I personally came with my sister to the States in December 1939. And so basically what I'm going to tell you about are things that are in these records, but I really didn't have access to most of this information until my late 40s. In terms of the question you've asked about what happened after the Anschluss, I think three things come out from these records. The first thing is, what's interesting is that Polish male Jews, right from the Anschluss, were in great jeopardy. And they were sent to Dachau. So, and Dachau at that time wasn't a killing camp. It was really for forced labor. So if you were a Polish Jew in Vienna, starting with the Anschluss, you were in trouble. And throughout my time there, my father was pursued, and all my other male relatives was pursued almost constantly. In terms of my impression of these records, so one was the fact that my father was pursued. The second thing was the laws were established that if Jews owned any property, it was taken away. And if you worked for an Aryan employer, you had no job. So basically, the big problem in the family was there's no income coming in. And the third thing was that there's this rush to get out. So contacts with relatives from countries all over the world was in everyone's mind. So I'd say those are the three things outside of being harassed on the street or some major other harassments that took place starting with the Anschluss. But my family was my father was in jeopardy almost constantly, and there was no money coming in.
So how are we time-wise? Do we still have time for 2 more questions? Okay. So just maybe to give a little bit of context why your father, as a Polish citizen, was particularly targeted. This target started in 1939 with the war with the start of the outbreak of the war, but before, in 1938, he already lost his citizenship, and this is something you actually found papers, right? That the Polish government.
So what my father did when couldn't earn a living and really was desperate, so he decided we were going back to Poland. So he petitioned the Polish government. He hadn't been in Poland in 20 years. So he petitioned the Polish government to return. And the Polish government came back and said, well, since you left right after the First World War, we abrogate your citizenship. Not only your citizenship, but your wife and your children under 18 years of age. Very fortunate, because my father had a huge contingent of relatives in Poland, and they all perished. About 90% of them did. So that was the first thing. My sister tells a story about my father babysitting us one day in the apartment, and 2 SS men come up, knock on the door, and want to take my father away. And my father says to him, well, I can't. I don't want to leave the kids alone. And their mother is in the building. When she comes with a neighbor, comes back, I'll come down and meet you downstairs in the entranceway. So my mother returns. My father goes downstairs, and as he's leaving, just about to make contact with them, he sees a trolley coming by right on the street, and he jumps in the trolley, and he got away. And as a consequence, they kicked us out of the apartment, and we lived with our grandparents for that time. Third thing with my father continually, what was interesting is even after these incidents, they didn't go after him individually, but whenever something came up and they wanted to get a lot of Jews, he always was contacted. So he's on some kind of a list that, of annoyance. And the third thing is, so finally my father decides he's got to get out. He won't be able to last. And he ends up buying a landing ticket to Cuba. So he ended on the St. Louis. And in that experience of a month of terror, they weren't able to get off the ship in Havana, and they circled up and down the Florida coast, and they ended up returning to Europe. My father was fortunate in that he ended up in England, where the people who ended up in France or Belgium or Holland, a good portion of them didn't survive the war. So he ended up in England, and he ended up in, well, I guess the English story is another chapter. I'll stop there with my dad.
And you will also have the chance to ask some questions. So I'm going to ask one last question, and then we open the floor. Can you hear me? Yeah. And someone will collect the cards that you got. I still think it's important also to mention your mother, Mignon, because she remained in Vienna. She took care for her elderly parents.
Her parents. Her parents are old. I mean, they're in their 70s. Anyhow, and but her mother was suffering from throat cancer, and her father was an old, frail 70. And there was no way they could take care of themselves. So there was no way that she could get out.
And I just wanted to say this is actually a situation that is very characteristic for many Jewish families, that women often stay behind, facilitated the escape of their husbands, as was the case with your mother. And then she also, which was incredibly lucky, was able to facilitate your escape from Vienna of you and your sister.
Well, we had, in 1938, my mother's sister was married to an Austrian who was born in Vienna and managed to get out really early. So she ended up coming to the States in 38, and my mother was in contact with her for the family, and she decided that based on an experience she had where her father was almost taken, that and my grandfather from my father's side was actually taken, and she said that if old people couldn't survive, then their children were at risk. So she had a friend that was coming to the States, and she put my sister and I on a boat, and we ended up in New York in late December of 1939.
And do you want to just share like some of your recollections when you arrived here, and yeah,
well,
in the orphanage?
Some of my recollections. I mean, one story I tell, but Ted Koppel or Mike Nichols told the same thing. When I got off the boat, I pointed to a sign that said no smoking, and I said to my uncle, "No Jews allowed." Now I didn't remember it, but my uncle always told the story to my embarrassment. And then my aunt and uncle were having major troubles, so we ended up in an orphanage, the Israel Orphan Asylum, which is located, I don't know if you're familiar with it. It was actually a great place to stay. It was located down on Avenue B and 2nd Street. And we went to locals. My sister and I stayed there 3 years. And then after the 3rd year, things didn't look good for Jews in Europe. So my aunt and uncle, and then by that time my father had come from England, and they made a home for us.
Thank you so much. So I think we can open up the floor now for questions.
I always thought it was ironic that Franz Werfel from Vienna was the one who wrote the 40 Days of Musa Dog, and he was the one who publicized the Armenian massacre, and then he went to Hollywood and he wrote the Song of Bernadette. So I'm just wondering, people didn't get the message about the Armenian massacre. That was kind of the presage of what was to come, and yet it had no real, beneficial effect.
Yes,
Can I answer
that's
just the one thing. While we're in the orphanage, my sister participated in in a rally, Madison Square Garden, called "We Shall Never Die." I don't know if any familiar. Yeah. And at that point, it was really the first time people understood what was happening in Europe. So up to that point, terrible things were happening, but it wasn't clear that people were being killed.
What year was that?
1943. This is 1943.
just to answer quickly your question. So Franz Werfel was actually quite an ambivalent factor as well, because he, during the Austro-fascist government, very much supported also Schuschnigg and Dollfuss, which the Austrian fascist government also contributed to really weakening democracy, right, already before, and persecuting socialists and social democrats. So, and still, I think in Austria, people were aware of what was going on in Germany, but in Germany, it really took 5 years to slowly introduce anti-Jewish measures, right? And in Austria, it was really overnight. And that's something that people could not expect. And some people, you might be familiar with the whole dramaturgic events of, there was actually not an election, a voting, whether people, a general vote was planned before the Anschluss, like as a last measure of the Austro-fascist government to kind of prevent the Anschluss from happening. And this vote was supposed to be on Sunday, the March, that would have been March 13. And in a way, like, the Austrian Nazis already managed to take over most institutions before even the first German soldier crossed the border. So it was actually definitely not the first, Austria was definitely not the first victim of Nazi aggression, as it was very much the narrative after the war. But what I was about to say, many people actually decided to stay in Austria, even though they were aware then that it was dangerous, and maybe even, I'm looking at Kathy Leichter here, whose grandparents were very famous social democrats, and even they stayed, I don't know if your grandfather stayed, but at least they stayed to cast a vote because they felt like, you know, they could still turn things around. So that was also one of the things. Nobody expected things to happen so quickly. That's a long answer.
In the back, and you can just shout out your question.
Sure. George, I'm wondering if you might just say a word or two about Mignon's experience in Vienna during this time, because as we see her image depicted here, her life in Vienna when Vienna was Judenrein was so extraordinary in working for the Jewish hospital.
Well, my mother stayed in Vienna, and one of the few surviving Jews. I mean, by 1943, I think Vienna was almost 100% Judenfrei. There were not many Jews. However, later on, Hungarian Jews were Jews, I think 17,000 Hungarian Jews ended up in Vienna in 1944. So Jews came back. Some Jews came back, but basically by 43, it turned the original Jews in Vienna. They were gone. So my mother originally was just a housewife, and taking care of her parents. And then we had a neighbor who had a position with the Kultusgemeinde, the Jewish organization. And they were having a lot of trouble because as people were fleeing Vienna, they were leaving their parents behind. So they needed volunteers for the nursing homes. So my mother volunteered for the nursing homes. And there was an opportunity while she was in the nursing homes to be trained as a professional nurse, because they anticipated they would have need for nurses. And she trained, and by the middle of the war, she ended up being a nurse in a children's hospital for children of mixed background, Christian, who had an Aryan parent of some kind, and they wouldn't treat that child in a regular Viennese hospital. So they needed a special hospital to treat these kids, and my mother ended up being a nurse. And she experienced in that time a whole variety of different problems. The bombing. No one is that aware in this country about the extensive bombing, the Allied bombing. And her apartment was bombed. Her neighbor was killed, waking her up. She came back from a nursing shift, and the sirens went off, and he went up to get her up, and coming down the stairs, a bomb hit, and the neighbor died within a month. Another time, she was in a shelter, and the shelter got bombed, and I think half the people, or a quarter of the people in the shelter got killed. And she was called in 1941, the first wave of people being sent to Poland. She actually got notice to report this collection center to be sent away. And at that point, it looked good that she could get her visa, her parents to this country. So she wrote a letter and gave it to some official at the Kultusgemeinde organization, stating that she had all the means to leave, and she got a reprieve. And then, so then she survived from that. But, and what's amazing about her is she documented all these things in letters, in her diary. And another thing she did, I mean, I don't know, she had a horrible time, but she had a lot of courage. My mother had a lot of courage.
Maybe I should just add that the letters and the diaries were actually published by George and another historian, Elisabeth Fraller, in German. So the book is available in German, I think in Hebrew, but not yet in English. So maybe if there's some interest, maybe we can. And just a note, and then maybe we should close this event, but just a note, so Vienna actually, even though it was supposed to be quote unquote free of Jews, right, it never was. That's the great irony, because there were a few thousand people who were in so-called mixed marriages, and children, half Jewish children, and these were the ones, for technical reasons, up to the very end of until the very end of the war, they were always kind of they were not yet deported, but it was never sure for them that when they would be on the list. So they kind of survived, and until I think it was in February 45, in January 45, when their deportation was decided. So it was never planned for them to survive. But since it was so close to the end of the war, most of them did. But that's why there was a need to keep a Jewish hospital, to keep a Jewish orphanage,
and to keep a nursing home. And that's why a small amount of people, in total it was less than 200 people who were like minion employees of the Jewish community.
That's all the time we have, but we can continue the conversation downstairs in the exhibit. And thank you so much to our speakers. That was wonderful. Thank you.